shrink down that. Just trying to figure out how to make everything work. Good, you can hear me. That's good to hear. I'm also not sure how much of a lag there is between me talking and what you'll see on the screen. So you'll just have to bear with me as I paint and describe what I'm doing. And hopefully it's not too confusing or too hard to keep up, because I have a feeling I'll be a little bit ahead of the broadcast as we go here. Yeah, it is exciting to do this in real time. I'm really excited to be able to paint live with you guys. This is something I've wanted to do for a long time. And one of the reasons I haven't is because I have all kinds of cameras, but I wasn't able to find anything that worked good as a webcam. And so I finally just sat down and decided I was going to make it work if it killed me. And so I've been doing that most of this week. And it's not the greatest little camera in the world, but if it works, then if this pays off, then we'll know it's something I can invest a little more time and effort and energy into getting to work. I have a really great camera that I use for my online courses, but for some reason it won't let me broadcast live. We'll wait a couple more minutes before I actually get started and welcome you all here. While we're waiting, and that sound you hear in the background is me spritzing my palette with this spray bottle. I always like to make sure the colors are nice and moist, and that saves me time as I'm painting. I don't have to pick up water with my brush to wet down my palette. And that reminds me, there we go. I was going to open up my new brush today. This is a Princeton Art and Brush Company. It's a number 16 round. It's actually the same one as I'm using, but as you can see, there's a difference in how pointy the tip is. And I find that as I paint, the tip gets worn down and I don't get the fine lines that I like. So this one is time to retire, and it can be used for scrubbing or student work or for my kids maybe. And then this one will take over. And I'm just gonna let it soak for a minute and soften out. They put, I think, gum arabic in it to keep those bristles nice and stiff in the store. So I'm just going to soak it in water till that loosens up and gets nice and soft. You hear me twice with an echo. Anybody else hearing me twice with an echo? It shouldn't be, because I have my speakers muted and my microphone on. And Dina's saying I seem to be in order. There doesn't seem to be a lag, so that's exciting to hear. That was another obstacle that we had to surmount, was trying to make sure we had good internet in my studio. And okay, so first of all, I want to welcome everybody here. We have just a few seconds before it's actually 1:30 according to my clock. Everyone else says they're hearing me nice and clear without an echo, so that's good. Might just be, if you're hearing an echo, it might just be an issue with your own speakers. So I just want to welcome you all here. If you are enrolled in my online classes, would you mind maybe just listing which class you're in, if you're just in one, or if you're in a bunch of them? I'd love to hear which one's your favorite of my online courses. And I'd love to hear that. And I think it would give the other, anyone else here on the broadcast, an idea of maybe which classes people get the most use out of or have found the most beneficial for you in your painting journey. So if you want to leave that in the comments, I'd love to see it. And what I wanted to do today was just start with talking a little bit about my process. I'm going to share a photo with you, and actually if you scroll down below the video into the description, you will see a link to a Dropbox folder, and that includes 2 reference photos. Let me see if I can pop them up on the screen here. Oh. We'll start with this one. Screen share. There we go. So right now you should be looking at this beautiful autumn scene. This was posted on my Facebook group, Angela Fair Watercolor Workshop by Carolyn. And I believe it's in the UK somewhere. Carolyn, if you're here, you can just mention whether or not that's where you are. I think you said England. And it's beautiful here. Outside my studio is snowy, and my kids are out sledding. But you guys still have the autumn colors, and that's pretty nice. I know we get autumn very early in Canada. So if you go to the Dropbox folder, if you want to paint along, which you totally aren't obligated to do, this is the photo I'm going to start with. If we have time, we'll talk a bit about the other photo as well, which is another lovely autumn scene. But for now, we're just going to work with this one. What I like about this photo is that it has beautiful contrasts of light and dark, and the darks are very dark indeed, almost black. And then the color of autumn that's showing through in the brighter areas is just so vibrant. I think it looks like it would be really fun to paint. So we'll just do some exploring of that subject here. Oop. There we go. I think I'm doing this right. Okay, I'm just catching up on comments. That's why I'm not talking. Okay, so did you guys get a chance to look at the landscape picture? It looks like it came up on the screen. I'm trying to decide if it's easier for me to use which screen is working here. Yeah, I have some students who are saying they are in all my classes. A few newbies that are just getting started. Some of you are in the free course, which I like having because it gives you an idea of my style. And then another one says, I'm in your basic techniques course, which is a great beginner course for anyone getting started in watercolor. It really gives a good overview of watercolor techniques. And I'm a firm believer that if you know your watercolor techniques, then you can be free to create whatever you want on your page and in your paintings. So, once you get that basic grasp, it's really a skill, just like we all started out learning to write our names and form our letters. And that was not something that our teachers expected we could do the first time we picked up a pencil. We were, taught how to do things properly. It was a skill that we built. And yet somehow people seem to think that when it comes to painting and art, you have to have this inner gift. And I really believe that if you have the desire, you can create beautiful paintings and build your skills so that you have the ability to create some gorgeous art. And the idea being that, once you have those skills, you can use them creatively. So we're just going to get started with this reference photo. I've got it beside me here on my tablet. And so I've got it right beside me. And then the cool thing about the tablet, it's a good and bad kind of aspect, is that, why is it not showing up here? Sorry, just double checking. Yeah, I think there is a bit of a lag. I'm just going to have to act as though I don't see it. And I'm going to have to try to focus. I'm trying to do too many things at once. This is all a learning curve for me, so I hope you'll be patient with me. Like I said, I have my tablet here, and the kind of annoying yet good thing about the tablet is after a few seconds, the screen goes blank and you can't see the image anymore. And so it keeps you, in one way, it keeps you from relying too heavily on your reference photo. And but then at the same time, you do want to be checking back to make sure you're not just assuming you know what you're supposed to be painting. And so if you're looking right now, you can see that I'm starting to put down some very vibrant color. And what I'm going to try and do is paint those vibrant colors very loosely with a lot of water. You can kind of see how moist that is. I'm getting a stronger shadow. Sun's coming out. I'm going to see if I can filter that light a little bit. Without making it too dark in here. There. There's always a way. Okay, so now we have a little bit better light without that strong shadow that's happening. Now, I know that you guys, generally I have students that just are so fearful of that idea that I'm not sketching before I start painting. And I haven't even talked to you about, my process in deciding what I'm going to paint first. And there's just so much to tell. And that's why I have 7 online courses. There's a reason. There's a lot to, with watercolor, you never stop learning. You never stop experimenting. And so as I'm painting, before, I'm always learning, I'm always growing, and I never feel like I've arrived. I'm just like you guys. I feel very much a student of watercolor, and I'm just going to keep feeling that way for the rest of my life. And so I've accepted that, and I encourage you to do the same. And so I want to talk a little bit about the decision-making process. And what you're seeing here is I'm blocking in that strong pattern of light, the brightest colors in the page. And what I try to do when I'm starting a painting is to immediately ask myself, where are the lights and darks? And I'm working from there. And when I know where my strongest darks are and my brightest values, and this reference photo, and I do encourage you to have it up on your screen so you can toggle back and forth so you can see what I'm talking about. So if you have it in another window in your browser or something, that would be helpful. Because what we're looking for in any dynamic painting is we want to have a strong pattern of values. And by value, I mean those lights and darks. So the darkest values in your painting, you want to make sure that they contrast well with the lightest values. If everything's kind of a medium tone, then you end up with a very blah and neutral painting. So when the first thing I do when I'm evaluating a painting, and with this reference photo in particular, you really see a strong contrast. The darks are very dark and the whites are very light. And you get that whenever there's strong sunlight, the shadows are darker. So that's one of the reasons we have that strong contrast. And so what I'm trying to do at this early stage of the painting is just nail down those lightest and brightest values. So I'm kind of trying to plan to paint around some of the few whites in this image and then keep my brights nice and bright. So I'm just going to keep kind of doing that. And I'm not looking at this as trees, road, background, hills at this point. I'm really just trying to see my light values as one complete shape. And that, I think, is the key to not drawing before you start painting. And I know it's, unfortunately, my webcam only picks up so much. So I'm going to really try to, I'll just scooch over so you can see more of the painting, less of the palette. And I'll just have to tell you what colors I'm picking up as I pick them up. So when I'm looking at the values, I stop looking at the individual objects in the image, and I start looking just for the lights and darks and kind of trying to nail down some of those colors. So right now I've got a little green gold on my brush, and most of the colors I'm using today are Daniel Smith. I really like their pigments. And I want you to understand too that the cool thing about value, and I'm just kind of marking where this darkest road shadow is going to be right along here. But sorry. I'm feeling like this, never mind, anyhow, we'll keep going. For some reason, my camera is mirrored. I'm painting right-handed and I'm actually left-handed. I'm not sure why it's doing that. So but it's better than having the camera upside down, which is what it wanted to do earlier on in this stage of the paint when I was setting up. Okay, so as I'm looking at everything as being a complete shape, that gives me a little more freedom to explore with my colors and my shapes. And it really frees you from having to draw, because instead of saying tree, 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 road, you know, and you're looking at all these individual objects, you're kind of looking at it as all one shape, and you're fixing it in relationship to everything else. And it does actually give you a lot more freedom. And you'll be amazed at how loosely you can paint and still get that sense of exactly what it is. And if you don't believe me, I encourage you to pick up a watercolor magazine, or really any art magazine, and take a look at some of the paintings in there. There's always going to be an artist who paints just the vaguest suggestion of shapes, and maybe it's a city scene, maybe it's portrait, and they get terribly loose with it, incredibly loose, and yet you can still tell exactly what they were painting. And it's very dynamic, and the dynamics are what I love. Okay, I'm just checking up on your comments so I can try to respond to them as you say them. They don't get buried. And there is a reason why we do, but when I record my classes in advance, I feel a little bit like I'm jumping around and changing the subject in the middle. And I hope that it's not too confusing for you guys. This is just going to be a whole learning process for us. Now, in this image, we've got these brights in, and I almost think we could go a little brighter. And I just put some blue right down there for a shadow. So we will spread it out a little bit, and then I'll just leave it for now. But I want this yellow to be brighter. I really want this area of the painting is in our photo, it's very dynamic, it's very strong and bright, and I want that to happen here too. So I'm going to grab some Nicolezo yellow. That's one of my favorite Daniel Smith yellows, and the reason I love it is because when you touch it down on the paper, it starts to spread, and look at how it flows out from that brush stroke. You really get a strong flow and movement from that Nicolezo yellow. And I'm going to pull some of this yellow up into the upper part of the painting. This is where we're going to have dark shadow tree, but there are little hints of bright color peeking through. And let's try to work in larger shapes. And again, see how that yellow just spreads across the page. Another yellow I have here that does a similar movement is Indian yellow, and this is made by Core, which is a company of watercolors by Golden Artist Colors, and it's another beautiful yellow. It's a little more of a school bus tone. And I'm just going to throw that down and let it flow up. And you can see how much water I put on with my brush, and that's one of the reasons I like using a big brush, is because it has a body that holds a ton of water. And then you can really get a lot of mileage out of that one scoop of pigment or color. And a newer synthetic brush, of course, holds that nice fine point, and without being super expensive. The other thing I want to do is throw some sky in here. And the photo I have, I actually think it was taken from through a windshield of a car, and so that's one of the reasons the blue is so bright over here, is because of that tinted part at the top of the windshield. But it's also very pretty. But I'm going to use French ultramarine blue, another Daniel Smith color. And I'm going to be a little bit careful. I don't think it will matter too much if I touch the yellow, because like I said, this is going to be dark shadow later. But I also don't want to get carried away, because whenever you're painting in watercolor, you're going from light to dark. Every time I put my brush on the paper, I'm subtracting white from the image. And so I don't want to subtract that white and go too strong with any one color and not be able to kind of reverse my steps. So it is good to have a lighter hand. And as I say that, I throw down this big blue splosh. I'm going to tilt my board a little bit and give that paint an opportunity to flow that way. I do not want this yellow coming this way. So we're going to let gravity help us out there. And one reason I like this French ultramarine blue is you can see the texture I get on the page as it settles into the texture of the page. It's got a beautiful granular texture. If you like this shade of blue but aren't a fan of those little granules, what you're going to want to do is use cobalt blue. Very similar color, but with a lot smoother finish. I'm just going to tilt my board for a few minutes here and let things settle down a little bit. And then I'm going to take a look at some of your questions. I'm wanting to kind of slow down here and do a little bit of evaluating. One thing I'm seeing as I'm evaluating, in the reference photo, there's a fence along here. We're going to ignore it. We're going to pretend it doesn't exist because it's not that pretty. And then over here, there's a big tall tree with a nice white trunk. We want that tree. So what we're going to do, everything's still quite damp here. So I'm going to just use my paper towel, pull down and lift out that trunk. And as you can see, I got this part lifted out because this was quite wet. This is drier, so it didn't want to lift. But that's okay. That actually works with our image because we have the tree coming out of this red underbrush. So I think that will actually work. And I didn't go back to, whoops, now I'm overdoing it. Good watercolor paper can handle that kind of treatment where you're rubbing and scrubbing it a little bit. And there are a very few other white branches here, but I'm thinking that I could probably scrape them in with a sharp little knife after my drying time is finished, rather than trying to lift out very fine white lines. And I don't really like using masking fluid, so scraping out would be easier than masking out, especially because I don't do all that planning ahead and drawing things out in the early stages. Okay, just going to your questions again, guys. Will this video be available to watch again? Yes, this will be on YouTube, and it will be on my channel, so you can check that out anytime. The other thing I should mention is the colors are much more vibrant in reality. I'm sorry that they're just not as brilliant as I'd like them to be. Limitations of my cheap camera. I have a question. Have you been to art school? You seem to speak in art rules sometimes. And I like that question because it makes me laugh because I haven't been to art school. I've taken a very few courses, very few. But most of what I've learned has been the hard way. Self-taught, trial and error, sitting in my studio all by myself. And the thing about art rules is they do kind of hold true. And sometimes, and yet when I'm learning by trial and error, I think sometimes those art rules, they kind of become personal to me when I've learned it through study, through practicing and working with values and colors and learning color theory and perspective and all that stuff. I have to own it. And I think maybe, I mean, I could have learned all that stuff in art school, but that sounds an awful lot like work to me. And I've really enjoyed learning watercolor kind of the fun way, exploring and experimenting and giving myself permission to make mistakes and fail. And so I encourage you to not feel like you have to be in school to learn how to paint. And don't feel like, you know, there's any right way to learn to paint either. My personal feeling is if you want to learn watercolor, and yet you just don't seem to be the kind of person who can apply themselves to learning the art rules, color theory and composition and all that stuff, just do it in whatever way works for you. You will learn it. Might take you slightly longer, but on the other hand, it might not, and you might just really discover something that, you know, you might just discover a way to paint that is uniquely yours. And along the way, you'll end up picking up all those art rules that they would have taught you in university anyhow. So that's my own personal feeling on the topic. Right now, I'm at a kind of mid-drying stage in my painting. You can see how shiny the sky is. It's very wet. And that's a good time if you wanted to use like a paper towel to lift out clouds. I'm not going to do that for this painting. Yeah, there's not really a lot of clouds showing up, although maybe there would be, down here, you could blot a little. And that's often how I will lift clouds, which works really well unless you're painting with phthalo blue, which is a staining color and doesn't like to lift once you put it on the page. Remember, with watercolor, we're generally working from light to dark, or I don't know that I always do that, but you really can't make dark things lighter in watercolor without a lot of scrubbing, which tends to hurt your paper. So you want to really plan not to paint over anything that needs to stay, light and crisp and clear. More comments below, that's what I need. Okay, just checking if you have a minute. If you want to ask some questions, you can do that right now. We're at kind of at a drying stage. I'm just trying to make sure I can see. Oh, I see Mary, you're here. Welcome. Mary was the winner of my big giveaway that I did last week, and that was a lot of fun. Welcome to anybody who signed up for that giveaway or learned about me through that. That was pretty cool to be able to do and see the great response. With watercolor, and you notice I'm not painting right now, and this is watercolor to me. It's this painting in short bursts that frequently I'll paint on something for 15 minutes, then I'll set it aside and paint on something else. And right now in my studio I have about 5 paintings on the go. Watercolor needs drying time. Drying time does a couple things. First of all, it helps you layer. You get, if you want to have beautiful crisp lines, if you want to have rich deep layers, you're going to have to allow for drying time as you build up your painting. The other thing that this drying time does is it gives you time. It gives you time as an artist to observe your reference image. It gives you time to think about what you want to do next. It gives you time to study what you've already done and determine what you like the best about it. Sometimes a painting that I've started will go in a completely different direction than I originally anticipated, just because, I learn a new way to paint trees that's more expressive, or the mood of the painting changes because of a color choice that was unexpected. I think I have one like that right here. Here's one I started recently, and you can see there's this violent pink down in the lower corner. And that was a new color on my palette that did not look like that when I picked it up on my brush. It was kind of a richer blue violet. And for some reason, as it dried on the paper, the blue kind of went into its own little cluster here in this granular shape, and the pink just took over. And so now it's like this whole mood of this painting has changed, and I'm going to have to decide, how do I roll with this and make this painting successful with this completely different color scheme. And one thing I will do is build up those colors. This pink won't be so violent as I layer over top of it. But it's just funny to realize that now I have to go in this whole new direction that I hadn't really planned. I was looking for something that was a lot softer. And in fact, I did that painting here. It's the same painting. And I changed up my colors, and you can see it's much more muted and subdued. And this is actually a lot what autumn looks like around my area about 2 weeks ago before it snowed. And I had lots of fun painting these aspen and birch trees with my local class, which happened last night. And talking about complementary colors, we used a lot of orange and yellows and violets in this. The orange and blue, yellow and violet work really well together to create a beautiful autumn mood, shadows and sunlight. So you just never know sometimes where a painting will go. And then after it's dried, you guys are going to ask, I know, what about using a blow dryer to dry your painting more quickly so you can just get to the next layer? And people do that. I don't. And one of the reasons I don't is because I've noticed that sometimes it changes the way the pigment dries on the page. I'm not sure why it does that, if it bakes it into the paper or if it brings it out to the surface or what's going on. But for some reason it does seem to affect the way that ink pigment dries on the page. And the other thing, well, I do paint with a lot of water, so of course then a blow dryer is going to blow some stuff around and move the pigment in a way I may not want. So you have to blow dry very carefully. And I really believe that thinking time is critical in developing a painting. You need time to evaluate and study and to understand what you want to do next. And sometimes that means setting a painting aside for days or weeks or even months to just, look at it and think about it and kind of wonder what it needs next. And so I do believe that thinking time to plan your next move is important, especially because with watercolor, like I said, you can't really remove stuff that you've put on in mistake without it starting to look fussed over and stiff and overworked. So yeah, take the time to really examine your painting and decide where to go next. Someone also asked me about not being able to access the free online course. It is still available, so if you are having trouble logging in for whatever reason, please send me an email and I can look into it for you. And I will put my email address down into the description at the end of the broadcast. Oh, and I did want to talk a little bit about my paper. Thank you for asking. I have here this paper. I've talked a lot about using good paper in watercolor. It's very important to use a watercolor paper made specifically for artists. And I say specifically for artists because student grade paper, generally if it says student grade, it's not really a great paper for painting with a lot of fluidity like we do here. If you're working with a lot of control and very little water, it's probably not an issue. But I find that the cheaper papers they dry differently and the color doesn't move the same way. And I do have a video about that on my YouTube channel where I compare different brands of paper. This paper here is same as this one here, and I have just a small piece to show you. And this paper is made by Indigo Art Papers, and you will see a link down in the description to their website, as well as a link to the supplier I use to purchase it here in Canada. And if you're in Canada and want to order it through them, and I don't know, maybe they ship internationally as well, but it is all on sale right now. And this is Indigo Art Paper. It's made by a company in India and distributed here in Canada by a guy who actually doesn't live that far from me. And I really like this paper because it's really tough. In fact, I cannot tear it. Ordinarily with watercolor paper, I buy it in big sheets, and then I grab a ruler and measure out what I want, and then I tear along the measured lines. And for this stuff, I can't tear it. It's so tough. So I have to use a knife to cut it. And so that durability really helps me when I want to paint with a lot of water. And I find too that the finish of this Indigo Art Paper, it comes in a cotton and in a cotton flax blend, and I've used them both. But the finish of it seems to really work well with my techniques of using a lot of water and letting things flow across the page. And even more so, I love the texture. I love the way that the pigment, kind of dimples into the crevices of the paper, the weave. And not only that, but I spoke with the founder of the company, and he was telling me that they don't use any bleach in their process. They're very environmentally conscious, and they want to, not harm the environment as they're making this paper. So they're not using chemicals or a lot of harmful chemicals in their paper making process. The paper is made by a family business in India. They're a big employer of women. And I really like that. I love the concept of, really caring for the environment and being conscientious about how we're making our paper. And so I like being able to support them and have a paper that I just love. So I encourage you to check them out, Indigo Art Papers. And this is the 300-pound weight, which I like because it's so thick. One thing you do get with the handmade paper is they're not always perfect squares. Sometimes the corner is shrunken in a little bit. So I have to be careful when I'm taping it down like this, and taping it does help keep it flat as I paint, just to make sure that I'm I'm making a nice, or I'm giving some margin around the edges, especially if the corner's a little bit shrunk and I don't want to have trouble at the framers because turns out I have a painting that's not a perfect square. Okay, looking at your questions again. How we use our brushes. And actually, I'm going to pull this aside and let it dry. In fact, we might even just come back to that in another session. I'm not sure yet. Just with my brush, I'm going to demonstrate a little bit of brush work. And this was something I didn't really think about until I started teaching, and that was how I use my brush. I love a big fat brush because it holds so much paint, but most of the time I'm working with a very light touch. I'm not squashing my brush down onto the page. And I talk about this, I have brush handling techniques explained in several of my courses. If you look at the syllabus, I believe I mentioned it in my landscape course, which is a great big course full of content. And I talk about it in, I believe, my basic techniques course, and definitely in loose and fluid too. And I really work with the tip of my brush, and with a big brush, you can still create beautiful fine lines just by varying your pressure and working very lightly. This brush is brand new, and you can see how tiny those lines can get. So I do just keep, I try to be gentle with my brush. I want it to last a long time. Another question here, water blooms. Water blooms are about, what's the word? It's really about the movement of water and the whole gravity thing, I think. When you have a nice wet piece of paper and you drop some color in, it flows beautifully, right? But when it hits the edge, the dry part of the paper, that's where you start to get an edge. And we all know that. We know that as soon as the paper is dry, the color is much more likely to stay where it's put until we tilt the page and see and let gravity maybe start a drip or something. But generally, the water follows the path of least resistance. Wherever it's wet, that's where the color flows. And so that does affect how blooms happen as well. And what I've found that blooms tend to happen when we are adding water into a damp area because the pigment isn't set into the paper yet. And so when you have a wash, and I see this a lot with beginners because as beginners, I know you guys, you tend to fuss just a little bit. And so a beginner, often when you're getting started with watercolor, you might take an area that's almost dry and it's a little damp, and you might you might continue to want to paint on it or move some of that color around. And of course, what happens is the water that's here is going to want to follow that path of least resistance. Because there is still some dampness, it moves a little bit, but it doesn't get to move as freely as it does on very wet paper. And it doesn't get to stay put like it would when you paint on dry paper. And so adding more moisture than is already on this damp area, and you're not seeing it very clearly here because I just did a tiny little dot, but it does, that's where the bloom comes from. It's this unequal ratio of water added to kind of a damp area. So the best way to avoid blooms, and I love blooms because now that I know how they happen, I can control and use them strategically in my paintings. But the best way to avoid a bloom is to be very careful about watching for that point of no return when things have started to dry so much that you don't have that shiny wetness that indicates that things are really going to flow well. As soon as it's damp but not quite dry, that's when you want to not touch it and leave it alone. You know that if it's damp, you're going to do a brush stroke and it'll leave a fuzzy edge. And if you add a little extra more water to it, then it's even going to create a bloom. And some colors will bloom and bleed more than others. I am fighting a little bit of a cold, so I hope I don't sound too sniffly. Another question. I get a lot of strokes when painting an object like a house or a flower. How do I avoid the plentiful strokes? And I think what you're asking about, Jordana, is seeing the brush strokes in a solid layered area. And what I think is probably happening for you is that you are painting too dry. When I mentioned, as I did my demo here, that I paint with a lot of water. But when you are painting too dry, which we want to paint dry because, you know, we want to have a fairly dry brush because we are timid. We don't want to make a mistake. We don't want to drip a ton of color down. But what happens is it dries so quickly that the strokes beside it, you're going to see those brush strokes, and I can't even do it. And that's partly because of my paper, I think. One thing you could check, Jordana, is what quality of paper you're using, because, again, the cheaper papers tend to dry faster, and you have less time to let those colors blend. So when I'm painting a large flat area, I want to use enough water so that my area is shiny, and very carefully fill that area. When I'm filling a large area, I'll work from right to left because I'm left-handed. I don't want to put my hand in wet paint. And don't allow anything to dry that still needs paint beside it. So you just want to work nice and moist. Have that shiny pigment on your paper. And because my paper is so good, like I said, it doesn't dry quite as quickly as it would with the cheaper paper. So I hope that helps. And I think we all have panic moments when we're painting. I know I still do. And I want to encourage you guys, it is almost always easier to lift up too much paint than too little. And what I mean by that is I'm going to use my dioxazine violet. It's made by Winsor & Newton, and it's a very strong color. And you can see here where I lay it down, it's almost black. And maybe I didn't want a purple quite that bright. Well, the good news is I can either blot it and lift some color off, which is a good way to lift color, but it doesn't give you a lot of control. Or I can spread it. And of course, spreading it means that you get to bleed it out, adding water, pulling it away. And so you can use just a little bit of color to fill a very large area and get that amount of darkness that you need. So I almost always encourage my students to paint, to start out with their color a little too dark than too light. Because if you have mixed up a color in your palette and then you throw it down on your, you know, on that very first stroke and you're like, oh no, well, the good news is you probably just need to moisten it a little bit and pull that color around, and then suddenly you end up with a beautiful flower petal. And not only does that flower petal have this lovely soft shade of purple, but it's slightly darker on this edge, which actually gives you this beautiful, interesting variation of color. And one other thing you can do is, as I mentioned, lifting with your paper towel, but you can also lift with your brush. And I often will blot out the water from my brush. I don't squeeze it hard, but I just blot it lightly, and it becomes a sponge for me. And then I can use it, just drag it across my surface, and it will absorb excess moisture, excess color. With a lot more control, I can use that little brush tip to really decide where I want to lift that color. It gives you a lot more control than you would with the paper towel. So those are a couple different ways to lift color. I'm just taking a look, guys, at my comments again. We are winding down. I wanted to do this for about 45 minutes. I like hearing you guys commenting on how much you like to connect across the globe. And I think so too. I think that's pretty neat. I'm glad we were able to find a time that works for a lot of people. I do have one thing I want to offer you guys. And I've been talking, you know, a lot of the stuff I've been talking about, I feel like I've covered it before. Oh, and my coffee's gotten very cold. I like cold coffee. Oh, and look at that. When I was busy painting with my violet, I managed to splash on my landscape. I can blot it, or I could just incorporate it into my shadows. I like making mistakes into beautiful, interesting events. So anyhow, what I was saying is I feel like I've said a lot of this before, and that's because so much of what I'm sharing today you can find in my online classes. Like I said earlier, I have 7 different courses, and I'm always sharing different ideas on how to just really maximize your watercolor experience, I guess. To use the techniques of watercolor to create successful paintings. It's important to me that I'm not teaching watercolor step by step. This is how you paint exactly like me. What I want to give my students is the opportunity to learn techniques so that you can interpret them in your own way. And so the idea is I'm going to share techniques, I'm going to share my processes. Follow along until you feel confident enough to start interpreting and painting on your own. And if you haven't ever purchased one of my courses, I have a special offer for you guys. And I know you guys who own a lot of my courses, you know that I'm always sharing discounts and pre-launches to my new courses, special deals before they launch. So I'm not worried about you guys so much today, but I did want to encourage anyone who hasn't tried any of my online courses, and I'm not including my free course, I'm talking about my paid courses here because they're so much more targeted and focused. And I'm just starting to paint the shadows of my scene here. I'm using indigo and a little bit of cobalt blue as well. And I think I'll probably throw some violet in as well. Anyhow, if that's you, if you haven't purchased any of my courses yet, I'd love to offer you half price off any one of my courses. So what I'd like you to do is visit my website, which is learn.angelafair.com, and I will throw the link down into the description after we wrap up here. And just take a look at the courses, see if there's one that would fit your interests, your learning style, if the subject matter appeals to you on the syllabus, and then email me. Again, information will all be down in the description after the class wraps up. And I will send you a coupon code for that one course. So you get half price off any one course. And like I said, guys, if you have all my courses, please don't be mad at me for not offering you a deal. I know that there's probably at least one of my courses you've gotten half price on in the past. So this is just for my new purchasers, and I do plan to do more of these online classes. We're going to finish this painting another day, but I am starting to throw in that shadow. Isn't that adding so much depth to the painting? I'm just going to move it again a little bit so you can see it better. Let's throw in some of that violet too. I want you to notice too that I tend to try to hold my brush kind of up in the middle of the brush itself. When I'm working really detailed, that's when I choke up way down here. But I want to be loose and expressive when I'm painting, and the best way to do that is to keep a loose hold on your brush and paint from the shoulder, not tightly from the wrist and cramped up and close to your page. I stand as I paint, gives me more freedom of movement. And I actually, that's another reason why I'm painting the size I am. This is 10 by 14 inches, which is what, 38 centimeters by 23 or something like that, approximately. And I can't convert metric in my head, guys. And anyhow, using a slightly larger page size gives you a little bit more freedom of movement. You're not cramped up trying to paint something really tiny. So I'm feeling like this is a good place to stop this painting for today. We are going to come back and work on this again. I think 2 weeks from now on a Wednesday afternoon, just like today, we're gonna have another session. I will schedule it as an event and send out an email. And I'll also post it in this description so you can always come back here and see the link to the next event, and so that we can connect them all that way. How long is the offer good for? My coupon codes, if you email me and ask for that 50% off one course, My coupon codes usually last a good long time before they expire, I think almost 2 years. So once you get that coupon code, it's your decision as to when you actually use it. Jordana, yeah, watercolor and oil and pastels, they are very different. It's a different approach, and so you do have to kind of wrap your brain around it in a different way, and that is a bit of a challenge. Anna, you've asked about the sketch course, so I'm going to do a plein air demo. I actually have something recorded. I'm not sure if it's any good yet, so I'm gonna just take a look at that and try and get that uploaded in the next week or so. Mostly I'll probably just be talking about principles of painting outdoors and why it's a useful thing to do, because it's pretty hard to demonstrate. I just found it was really hard to set up my camera, and it was a really bright sunny day, so I'm not sure that you'll see much more than strong shadows on the page as I'm painting outdoors. Another question, Jordana, you were asking about the water ratio. I definitely am using less water for the road, the shadowed road here, than I did up here. Here I almost had a puddle, a bit of a pool happening as I spread the water out. And here I just kept it kind of shiny, juicy, but not drippy, if that makes sense. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm getting lots of thank yous, and I appreciate that. It was fun to do this. I'm feeling a little hoarse. I might have to pack some cough drops or something for next time, or at least more liquids. I really love teaching watercolor, and I love showing what I'm doing. And it's nice to have, you know, a whole group all over the world in my studio today. And I'm looking forward to doing this again. And YouTube tells me that I can broadcast for up to 8 hours. So really I could just keep going, but I think we'll save that and save my voice for another day. I like being able to answer your questions. And now this painting's at a good stage where I can sit and look at it and think about what we're going to do in our next session and how I'm going to approach it to get it to a more complete stage. I find with my paintings, I tend to work in about 3 layers of paint. So this is kind of layer 1. And then I still want to fill in some of these white areas, and then we'll, you know, build up with layers 2 and 3, and I'll talk about the process and why I do it in that kind of order, in that many layers. Thank you, everyone, for coming online, making the time out of your day. I appreciate that. I love my career. I can't tell you how exciting it is to be in the watercolor community with all of you, and how much you guys encourage me to keep painting. And it's very humbling because, like I said, I still feel very much like a student of watercolor. I will always be learning, and I have so much more to learn. And so I love being able to do that with you. And I learn a lot whenever I teach, so thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm loving your comments. I'm looking forward to reading them over. I'm sure I missed a few. Yeah, goodbye, everyone, from my place up in northern British Columbia. And thank you again for coming online. We're going to do this again. And it was lots of fun. So thank you. I'm going to close off now. And if I can figure out how to do that, or maybe you will be stuck with me for a couple hours. Have a great night. And here in my area, have a great rest of the afternoon.